Hey guys, we have got 2 lectures to get through this week. We're going to talk about the bureaucracy and then the American legal system and the courts. I hope you enjoyed your special no quiz week last week. I did still put everybody down for 100 for that. But we will get through 2 lectures this week. Next week we will have a lecture on public opinion, and we will have our third quiz because the week after that, the week of October 25th, you will have your second exam. And I'll also hand out or post your essay prompt. And you will have until Monday, November 29th to turn that in. Our final day of class and our final exam is Monday, December 6th. It doesn't feel like it, but we're getting there. It's not a ton left after this. I guess maybe we're a little over halfway through. So today we're going to talk about the bureaucracy. And the book opens with talking about regulating the internet. Can we regulate the internet? The internet used to be this frontier of information technology where people freely communicated and individuals wrote their own rules. These entrepreneurs like Bezos and Zuckerberg created their empires. Now we have to pay to access a lot of news sites, right? We now have to pay sales tax on purchases we made online, which that actually happened when I was working in Congress. It was a big fight. We expect to pay for an internet provider, but having our access limited beyond that seems unfair. This is the heart of what's called net neutrality. Obama endorsed this idea in 2007, and under his FCC, adopted a net neutrality policy that was challenged by Verizon and actually overturned in 2014. In 2015, the FCC voted in favor of the principle that all internet traffic be treated the same. There was a congressman who's a Republican who actually voted in favor of this legislation who said, the last thing we want to throw on there is the cold water of Washington bureaucracy, after the fact regulation that will stifle competition and innovation. And something to think about. We've got this free world out there that we're trying to make into a bureaucracy. Almost no one aspires to be a bureaucrat, right? You don't grow up and say, I'm going to be a bureaucrat when I grow up. My husband and I have both done that. It's hard to define what a bureaucrat is, right? But they give us our driving tests. They work at the DMV, renew our license, deliver our mail, maintain our parks, order books to the library, send us our social security checks, ensure our military benefits, process student loans, find jobs through unemployment offices, defend our country, chase our crooks, get us aid in times of natural disaster. Civil service is seldom admired or esteemed, and is often the target of jokes that they're lazy, power-hungry, uncaring, and incompetent. But bureaucracies are essential to running a government. They're often the only ground on which citizens and politics actually meet, the only contact many Americans have with the government except for a periodic trip to the voting booth. So what is a bureaucracy? It's an organization characterized by a hierarchical structure, worker specialization, explicit rules, and advancement by merit. German sociologist Max Weber's model of bureaucracy was that there would be a hierarchy, a clear chain of command that exists where employees know who their bosses are and who they're responsible for. There would be specialization. The effectiveness of the bureaucracy would be accomplished by having tasks that are divided and handled by an expert and experienced full-time professional staffs. There would be explicit rules. Bureaucratic jobs are governed by rules rather than bureaucrats' own feelings or judgments about how the job should be done. So bureaucrats are really limited in the decision-making and discretion that they have. One person in this job is expected to make pretty much the same decision as another, leading to standardization and predictability. And then merit. Hiring and promotions are often based on examinations, but also on experience or other objective criteria. Politics in the form of political loyalty, party affiliation, or dating the boss's daughter is not supposed to play a part. But Herbert Kaufman, who's a political scientist, said the closer a government comes to making their bureaucracies look like the Weber model, the closer they are to achieving a neutral competence, which is the principle that a bureaucracy should be depoliticized, making it more professional. Having politics out of the administration, having work done expertly rather than by personal preferences or party loyalty, not having it be a political arm of the president or Congress, but rather it should be neutral, administering the laws of the land in a fair, even-handed, efficient way. Why do we need a bureaucracy? Large tasks require organization and specialization. We can't put a man on a moon alone. Many bureaucracies are public, like those that are part of our government. But the private sector has the same demand. corporations, businesses, hospitals, universities, your very school that you're sitting in. There is a need for a structure of hierarchical expert decision making. If we value democracy and the corresponding idea that public officials should be accountable and responsible to the people, how can we also value bureaucracy in which decisions are often made behind closed doors by unelected experts who, because of civil service protections, are difficult to hold accountable? We need to consider that maybe democracy isn't always the best way to make every kind of decision. Decisions would be made slowly, and though the decisions would be popular, they wouldn't necessarily be made by the people who know what they're doing. If you want heart surgery, you don't poll the American people or even the hospital employees. You want an expert to make the right decision, not the popular decision, and you want them to make it quickly. Democracy couldn't have designed our rocket ships that formed our space program. They couldn't have decided the temperature that beef should be cooked at in restaurants to prevent food poisoning. Bureaucracy is needed, but it's not everything. Accountability is the principle that bureaucratic employees should be answerable for their performance to supervisors all the way up their chain of command. You need to have accountability all the way up to the top. Who is responsible for seeing that things get done, and who does that person answer to? The lines of accountability are less clear in a public bureaucracy. The Constitution doesn't provide for specific rules of the operation of a bureaucracy. Congress has filled in a piecemeal framework that usually ends up promoting the goals of members of Congress. So to solve the problem of accountability within a bureaucracy and to prevent the abuse of public power at all levels, we need to resort to rules. If the rules are clearly organized and well publicized, it's easier to tell if a job's being done and if it's being done fairly. There shouldn't be favorites. There should be no special favors or preferential treatment. An organization shouldn't be run at the expense of the public good. They should not be taking advantage of power. If everyone follows his or her job description, the supervisor can know what, within some limits, is likely to happen. If an important task is left undone, it's possible to determine who didn't do his or her job. But bureaucratic jobs can become rule-bound. Deviations from the rules can become unacceptable, and individuality and creativity are stifled. And workers are rewarded for following the rules, not for fulfilling the goals of the organization. Compliance with the rules need to be monitored. And the best way we've developed to guarantee compliance is to generate a paper trail, an electronic record of what has been done. So it all has to be standardized. And hence we have these endless forms for which bureaucracies are so famous, which are usually called red tape. We call these bureaucratic hurdles red tape. Red tape is the complex procedures and regulations surrounding bureaucratic activity. It was named for the binding that 17th century English officials used to bind legal document. It had this red tape on it. In the legal world, they have something similar. The great trade-off of bureaucratic life is that if we want strict fairness and accountability, we must tie the bureaucrat to a strict set of rules, a tight set of rules. If we allow discretion to reach rules, we may gain efficiency, but we lose accountability. There are a vast number of people who work for the federal government. It's huge. So we opt for accountability, even though we're always upset at the inconvenience of the rules. When does bureaucratic decision-making become a threat to our democracy? I'm going to let you think about that for a second. In 2014, more than 4 million people worked for the federal government, including the post office and the military. Only about 63,000 work in the legislative branch or the judiciary. The rest are in the executive branch, which is the home of the federal bureaucracy. There's something called the spoil system. So in the 19th century, there was this practice of firing government workers of a defeated party and replacing them with a loyalist of a victorious party. So it was often said to begin with Andrew Jackson, who said, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy." So for instance, Joe Biden has won his election. He is going to come in and fire everybody that Donald Trump had ever hired, everybody that ever worked in the administration, completely replacing it. That's called a spoil system. Patronage is, and that's not exactly what happens. I'll get to that in a minute. Patronage is a system in which a successful candidate rewards friends, contributors, and party loyalists for their support with jobs, contracts, and favors, which allows an elected official to use his job to pay off political debts and to gain cooperation from the officials who were hired this way, thereby strengthening this base of power. When you fill a bureaucracy with political appointees is what we call it in DC, it almost guarantees incompetence because those who get the jobs for political reasons are more likely to be politically motivated than genuinely skilled in a specific area. Experts become really discouraged because advancement then becomes based on political favoritism rather than how well the job is being done. America really got disgusted with this corruption and inefficiency, and it led Congress to institution reforms. Civil service is non-military employees of the government who are appointed through the merit system. So it's just a little background there. So the Pendleton Act was an 1883 act that reformed civil service. It required the hiring and promoting of civil servants to be based on merit, not patronage. It also created the Civil Service Commission that prohibited firing employees for failure to contribute to a political party or a candidate. The Hatch Act, this is something that my husband was still a part of when he worked for the administration, when it was a 1939 law that limited the political involvement of civil servants to protect them from political pressure and to keep politics out of bureaucracy. They had to fill out forms every so often that said, like, hey, like, this is the money I have in the stock market. I just, I'm not doing this based on any knowledge that I've gotten. I'm not running a campaign for a friend, running for school board, things like that, because it didn't need to get tied back to the position that they held. They can't run for political office if they're a civil servant. You can't head up an election campaign, make a public speech on behalf of a candidate. You can make contributions, you can attend rallies and work on registration or get out the vote drives that don't focus on just one candidate or party. It seeks to neutralize the political effects on a bureaucracy, but in doing so, it denies federal employees a number of activities that are open to other citizens. Most parts of the federal bureaucracy developed independently of others in like a piecemeal and political fashion rather than having this coherent plan. Kind of like how the roads in Lexington were built, I feel like. Some are fundamental, like foreign relations, money, and defense. Others have evolved. But federal agencies really fall into three categories. First is those designed to serve essential government functions. Second is those crafted to meet the changing needs and problems of the country. And then third, those intended to serve particular clientele groups. So the ones that serve essential government functions, this is going to be like the Department of State, War, and Treasury. It's not war anymore, it's defense. But those were the first cabinet offices because they're so fundamental to the smooth functioning of government. Imagine the effort to manage a debt that increases about $2.4 billion a day. That's the Department of Treasury. Responding to changing national needs. So when our country was founded, we didn't have this westward expansion that we have now, of course. This growth of manufacturing, this increased commerce that came with new demands for new roles in the government. The Department of Interior wasn't created until 1848, and I actually know that because that's their address. I used to work there. They made 1848 the number on their address, so everybody remembers that's when they were founded. It was created to deal with the effects of moving westward, including displacing Native Americans. The New Deal created agencies like Social Security. The Social Security Administration Agency had to be founded. Government was for the first time directly involved in the economic well-being of individual citizens, and Americans came to expect that government would play a large role in managing the economy and ensuring that people could eat and work and live in decent housing. And then 9/11, of course, led to establishing the Department of Homeland Security to coordinate efforts to protect the country. And then you have responding to demands of clientele groups, who are groups of citizens whose interests are affected by an agency or department and who work to influence its policies. This is going to be like USDA, the Department of Agriculture, set up to assist agricultural interests. So organization of a federal bureaucracy. They have four types of organizations. It can be a cabinet level department, like the Department of Treasury. It can be an independent agency, a regulatory board and commission, or a government corporation. Some can fit into more than one category. A department is one of the major subdivisions of the federal government, represented by the president's cabinet. The heads of these departments are called secretaries, like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, except, remember this, the head of the Department of Justice is called the Attorney General. He's not the Secretary of Justice, he's the Attorney General. It's Merrick Garland right now. They make up the president's cabinet. They're appointed by the president with consent of the Senate, and these areas are not fixed, and the president may propose different cabinet offices, but these secretaries are political appointees who change when an administration changes. They sit at the head of a large, more or less permanent bureaucracy called a department. So the person at the head of it changes with who is in office, but most of the employees within the agency are always there. So then there's something called an independent agency. These are government organizations that are independent of the departments, but with like a stricter policy focus, a narrower policy focus. They're structured a lot like a cabinet department with a single head appointed by the president, but they have narrower areas of jurisdiction than like a cabinet department does. So like the Federal Election Commission, the Social Security Administration, they're called independent because of their independence from cabinet departments, but they vary in independence from the president. Then you have independent regulatory boards and commissions, which are government organizations that regulate various businesses, industries, or economic sectors. The regulations or limitations or restrictions on the activities of a business or individual. They usually seek to protect the public from some industrial or economic danger or uncertainty, like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, regulating the trading of stocks and bonds. Then you have the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, regulating how drugs must be tested. Regulation usually pits the individual's freedom to do what he or she wants for a business's drive to make a profit against some vision of what is good for the public. Trade-off like this will always exist for the purpose of managing citizens' collective lives, and how each trade-off is made is between an individual freedom and public safety, and that's a question of public policy. Congress really wants to limit the influence of regulatory agencies because not all presidents view regulation the same way. And then you have government corporations like the post office. The U.S. Postal Service is one of the larger businesses in the country or in the nation in terms and scales of personnel. Amtrak is also a government-owned corporation set up to be largely independent of both congressional and the presidential influence. But if postage rates rise, President and Congress face heat. They've said now that it's going to be taking longer for our mail to get delivered. Government corporations are companies created by Congress to provide to the public a good or service that private enterprise cannot or will not profitably provide. Like the post office guarantees that the mail will reach the most remote corners of the country, where delivery service might not be profitable for a company like FedEx or UPS. But there is competition still with FedEx, UPS, Amazon, and a declining demand for mail service. And the post office is in financial trouble. Are some essential services now provided by the federal bureaucracy better left to the private sector? Do you think we should let FedEx and UPS take over for the post office? That's something to think about. So the roles of the federal bureaucracy. At the broadest level, is responsible for helping the president administer the laws, policies, and regulation of the government, but not confined to administering the laws. Bureaucracy is an all-in-one policymaker. They administer the laws, they effectively make and judge the compliance. We expect the agencies of the federal government to implement the laws, and they operate under the idea of neutral competence, like we talked about earlier. A public bureaucracy serves the political branches of government in professional, unbiased, and efficient manner. Sometimes it's exactly what bureaucrats do, like a ranger in a national park helps us enjoy our national parks. And then there's bureaucracy as a rule maker. Thinking of a bureaucrat as impartial or removed from political decision making is often unrealistic. There's a great deal of latitude in administering national policy. They often lack the time, technical expertise, and coherence to leverage to write clear and detailed legislation. So Congress sometimes passes laws that are vague and overly general, and the bureaucracy must fill in the gaps. So bureaucratic discretion is the use of a bureaucrat's own judgment in interpreting and carrying out the laws of Congress. It's like Congress doesn't say how many park rangers should be assigned to Yosemite versus Yellowstone. The Park Service has to interpret the broad intent of the law and make decisions on this and other specifics. The appropriate bureaucracy fills in the details. The Federal Register is the publication that contains all federal regulations and notifications of regulatory agency hearings. So if there's a new regulation that's going to become law, it has to be published there first. Bureaucracy as judge. They interpret the law in specific cases for potential violations and deciding appropriate penalties when violations are found. This is what courts do, but a great deal of adjudication in America is carried out by bureaucracy. Like you can go to tax court under the IRS, and they handle violations of tax codes. So who are the federal bureaucrats? About 46.9% of the United States civil labor workforce is female, but only about 42.7% of the civil service is female. 11.9% of the civil workforce or civilian workforce is African American, but actually 18.3% of the civil service is African American. And not all positions are equal. Policymaking is done at the higher levels, and the upper grades are staffed by predominantly white, well-educated males, just like always. So politics inside the bureaucracy. Politicians and bureaucrats are wary of the effects of politics on decision making. There can fairness and efficiency be achieved if only the struggle over competing interests can be set aside through an emphasis on strict rules and hierarchical organization? No, it can't be. Politics is always with us. It's a human activity. Politics within bureaucracies is a subset of politics generally. A bureaucratic culture is the accepted value and procedure of an organization. Any job, when you start, you don't know the accepted standards of behavior maybe, but you figured out over time who has the power, what your role is, which rules can be bent, which need to be followed strictly, and what the goals of the enterprise were. You understand that the accepted power narrative of your workplace, and you come to share some of the values of your colleagues, at least with your respect to your work, which adds up to the culture of a workplace. There are 4 elements of bureaucratic culture that define what's in stake within a bureaucracy. Policy commitment, adoption of bureaucratic behavior, specialization and expertise, and identification with and protection of the agency. So policy commitment. Good bureaucrats develop a commitment to the policy issues their agency is tasked with. Like a USDA employee is eventually going to come to believe that agricultural issues are among the most important in the country, even if he never thought about farming before this job. Not only because his job depends on it, because everyone else around him thinks this. And you start to adopt this bureaucratic behavior. Bureaucratese is the often unintelligible language used by bureaucrats to avoid controversy and lend weight to the words. Sometimes this is funny to the outside world. We speak in Alphabet City in DC. I feel like everybody has a abbreviation for everything. And these uses of acronyms and other linguistic shortcuts can make communication more efficient for those in the know, but sometimes it seems like an effort to avoid responsibility or seem more authoritative by using more and longer words than necessary. Specialization. So free spirits are likely to not thrive in a bureaucratic world, right? Because you are rewarded for deference, cooperation, and obedience. This is emphasized, this is rewarded. Relentless rule orientation and hierarchy can wear down all but the most committed independent souls. So specialization and expertise. Each department, agency, and bureau has specific areas of responsibility. There's not a lot of interagency hopping. So a lot of people spend their entire lives working in the same area, often in the same department. Like a soybean expert at the USDA has a specialized knowledge at the base of his power. Because of this specialization, bureaucrats know a lot more about their policy areas than the public or even politicians who make decisions relevant to these areas. This gives bureaucrats a lot of power in policymaking situations. So as bureaucrats, they start to identify with the agency. As they become attached to the policy interests of their agencies, they become more committed to the rules and structures, are concerned with the fortunes of their superiors, and appreciative of their colleagues and specialized knowledge. They come to identify with the department, not just because their job depends on it, because they really believe in what it does. And some of the consequences of bureaucratic culture, on the plus side, it holds the bureaucracy together, fosters values of commitment and loyalty to what could otherwise be seen as an impersonal and alienating work environment. People who work for the federal government, for the most part, really believe in what they do, and they do it well. But on the negative side, this culture can have a role in foreseeing and preventing things like 9/11. The FBI agents had said that this hierarchical culture couldn't allow them to get a warrant when they needed to. The FBI and the CIA weren't able to communicate with each other about the various pieces of the puzzle they had found because nobody had really connected the dots because the cultures at the FBI and the CIA were so different. They have kind of changed this a little bit since 9/11. But when an agency is in charge of making rules, enforcing them, even adjudicating them, it's relatively easy to cover up a less catastrophic agency blunder, not as big of a problem as if Congress or the media or the public had the sufficient information or expertise to interpret it. But specialization necessarily concentrates the expertise into the hands into the hands of the agencies, and the Congress and media are generalists. We used to say we are 6 feet wide, 6 inches deep in Congress. We know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about a lot of anything really. So you rely on your bureaucracy. Congress tries to check the temptation for bureaucrats to cover up their own mistakes by offering protection for what is called a whistleblower, an individual who publicizes an instance of fraud, corruption, or other wrongdoing in the bureaucracy. Obviously, this is rarely popular with your bosses or colleagues if you are considered a whistleblower. The Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989 established an independent agency to protect these employees from being fired or demoted or punished for exposing wrongdoing. So of the 2 million civil employees, about 3,500 are appointed by the president or his immediate subordinates. And this is what my husband's job was, but right before we left DC. These are called presidential appointees. So presidential appointees are sometimes considered birds of passage by the career service because they come and go quickly. They're usually quite experienced in their agency's policy area, but they have their own career or the presidential agenda as their primary objective rather than the mission of the agency, while career employees are more committed to what the agency does. There are a lot of clashes that can be intensified when a new president has a different ideology, but the president seeks to put his own people in higher ranks of agencies that do not agree with their policy preferences. So to kind of summarize this, so earlier I was talking about, Andrew Jackson would come in and replace all of his predecessors' employees throughout the entire bureaucracy and bring in only people who are loyal to him. Imagine if we did that now, if Joe Biden came in and replaced literally everybody that had ever worked in the Donald Trump administration. You can't do that because you lose the folks who have that expertise, that knowledge, that have been there and are a soybean expert or a expert at NASA. I mean, they're leaving politics out of part of this. And what they do is replace the folks at the very top, like the cabinet official obviously is going to be a presidential appointee. And then they have their staff as well. So there are parts of these agencies that are political and they're kind of responsible for the president's agenda. And then parts of these agencies that are called careers, and they're there forever kind of doing the non-political work of the agencies. Politicals have shorter time frames. They're usually there just for the presidential administration, whereas a career employee averages about 17 years and can expect to remain there for a lot of their career. But politicals have the advantage of a higher position of authority, but careers have time on their side to stall things maybe they don't like. I asked my husband to tell me about the power struggles between a political appointee and a career bureaucrat, and is this the best way to approach bureaucracy? He said, well, you need decision makers, which are political. Without this political leadership, you don't have the conduit to the elected leadership, the president. It's not, the career employees are not typically the politically savvy folks, but then they're not into the decision makers. It also allows you to bring in people from outside of the government. You can bring in people from industry, from academia, from advocacy that have a different perspective. You can also bring in people from across the country rather than just people from the DC area. So it kind of shakes things up in the agencies as well. Bureaucracy is often termed the fourth branch, but it technically falls within the executive branch. Still wields a lot of power, can be checked by the other agencies, by the executive, by Congress, by the courts, or even the public, but it's not wholly under the authority of any of these agencies. They need to build a constituency within the agencies. Members of Congress are sensitive to voters' wishes. So if they're trying to keep a bureaucracy around, if they're trying to keep an agency around to keep them doing good work and not cut their budget, Congress is going to need to know from their constituents that it would anger a lot of their voters if they, for instance, cut the budget of USDA. Obviously, like the IRS doesn't have a lot of fans, so they don't have a lot of groups who support them. But USDA works hard for farmers, so they would need strong support from agricultural clients. Agency capture is a process whereby regulatory agencies come to be protective of and influenced by the industries that they were able to establish to regulate. Agencies want to survive, and one way to survive is to offer services that no other agency provides. They don't want to overlap too much because they don't want to be seen as duplicative, because then they could be seen as unnecessary and have their budgets cut. One of the jobs of the president is to be the chief administrator. Most agencies have a clear chain of command with a cabinet secretary at the top who directly reports to the president, But the boss doesn't always get his way. JFK famously said that dealing with the bureaucracy is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. The president usually has a specific agenda that he was elected to accomplish, and they usually complain that their own departments and agencies are often uncooperative and unresponsive. The different perspectives and goals often are at odds. The president can use things like executive order, or administrative suggestions, directives, and encouragement, or in the case of Obama, if something is impossible, you can implement an existing law to achieve preferred policy. This is always subject to a Supreme Court challenge, especially if Congress is hostile. So the president appoints the heads of the agencies and undersecretaries, and their power is significant but watered down by the political realities of the policymaking process. The president has a key role in the budget process. So about 15 months before a budget request goes to Congress, each agency has to send their preferred budget to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which can raise or lower department budget. A presidential budget is a good statement of his overall program for the government, reflecting priorities and initiatives, intended cutbacks, his political will, testify before Congress to defend his budget. And his budget's a beginning bargaining point that Congress will freely add to or cut back on. The president can try to reorganize the bureaucracy, but they're really limited in the efforts and the need for congressional approval there. The office of the president impresses a lot of people, so the power of persuasion and the sheer weight of the office can often produce results. Few bureaucrats feel like they can stand face to face with the president and ignore legal order, but the president has a limited time in office and a lot of political pressure, so they choose and prioritize carefully. There are relationships between the bureaucracy and Congress that are not clear-cut, but individual members of Congress may have more control over bureaucracies than do the executive branch because of the informal policy-making relationships that have grown up over time and are now all but institutionalized. This is something called iron triangles, which is the phenomenon of like a clientele group, a congressional committee, and a bureaucratic agency cooperating to make mutually beneficial policy. There's a good illustration in your text of this. It's actually kind of been refined by scholars as more than maybe a triangle and maybe more complex as more of an issue network, more than just three people involved. Its relationships are more complex than a simple triangle, basically. Obviously, we have congressional oversight. I've mentioned that before. Efforts by Congress, especially through committees, to monitor agency rulemaking, enforcement, implementation of congressional policy. Agencies are usually really responsive to the congressional committees that are most directly involved with their authorizations and appropriations. I worked for the Oversight Committee, and we were specifically investigating the EPA when I was there. So we had a lot of requests out for documents and things for them, and they're pretty responsive. Sometimes they're slow, but they get you a lot of good information. The bureaucracy in the courts. Agencies can be sued by individuals and businesses for not following the law. So, for instance, if a citizen disagrees with the agency ruling on welfare eligibility or a ruling by the IRS, he can take the case to the courts. Generally, the courts just play a modest role in controlling the bureaucracy, though. It is a powerful arm, one powerful arm of the government, the bureaucracy, somewhat answerable to the president, more responsible to Congress, but with considerable discretion to do what it wants, often in response to the special interests of clientele groups or regulated industry. If anyone's forgotten, it's often the American people. An average citizen is not typically well organized and may not even know they're affected by an issue until it's already law. Public interest is probably best determined by increasing the number of people who have decided to be part of it. Politics dictate that the most organized, vocal, and well-financed interests usually get heard. Congress has made citizen participation a central feature in policymaking of a lot of agencies, typically in the form of what's called a Citizen Advisory Council, which is a group that considers the policy decisions of an agency, which is a way to make the bureaucracy responsive to the general public. Taking key policy decisions to the outside consideration is by members of the public. And their citizen access to these laws can also be enhanced by the passage of what's called a sunshine law, which is legislation that opens the process of a bureaucratic policymaking to the government. And then, of course, the Freedom of Information Act that allows citizens the ability to obtain copies of most public records. Few Americans try to access the bureaucracy because of the generally accepted narrative that tells us it's too big, too remote, too complex, too devoted to special interests. But one reason for the public dissatisfaction with bureaucracy may be that it's so constantly under the attack by a frustrated president and members of Congress. They're trying to divert attention away from things. Another reason may be that federal agencies and departments are not portrayed well in the media. But if you don't like what your government's doing, get in there and help and change it. If we were meeting in person, I would make you guys divide up into groups right now and talk about the bureaucracy of pizza. I just want you to think about this instead. You're going to take each part of a home-delivered pizza and brainstorm the federal agencies and departments that would regulate it in some way. You need to provide a brief example for each, a brief rationale. For example, the cardboard box that it comes in is regulated by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that regulates the manufacture of pulp and paper and pollutants produced from it. The tomato sauce, the USDA recommends that tomato sauce manufacturers add bottled lemon juice to their product to ensure a safe acidity level. What about the delivery vehicle? The EPA regulates and sets pollution emission and fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks. Everything, like literally everything. Bureaucracy touches every part of your life. There are federal rules and regulations on almost everything. So it's an important thing to learn about. All right, guys, I have another lecture coming later. Stay tuned, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks.